back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of World War I as we prepare to launch into our decade of the 1920s. In this lecture, we're going to be going over some background of one of the profound legacies of World War I, the ideological war on the home front, the battle for the hearts and minds and the support of the American people. In the previous lecture, I talked a little bit about Woodrow Wilson and his personal background heading into the presidency. And while we didn't go into great detail, we talked a little bit also about Wilson and his reluctance to have the United States join World War I, holding out throughout his entire first term and only joining the war after his re-election in 1916. But once the United States joined the war, Wilson saw the need to have the American war effort be as unified as possible, and recall his belief in Teddy Roosevelt being one of the most powerful figures in history because he had the backing of the American people. And so Wilson sought to win over the support of the American people for the war effort, even though he had campaigned and fought against it for several years. This required an abrupt about-face and a massive publicity campaign, which historians have come to call the ideological war on the home front, the battle to win over the hearts and minds of the American people to support something that Wilson himself had spent years campaigning against. So it's really quite a tricky and difficult situation, but Wilson thought it was vital because as president he always sought to have the support of the American people behind him. Now, the mobilization effort of the United States after joining World War I was incredible and impressive. The United States enacted the draft, created the War Industries Board, which would help to mobilize and coordinate efforts of industry and big business, created the National War Labor Board to regulate labor in the war industries. We're actually going to be talking more about that in some future lectures, and sparked a huge fundraising effort all across the country, including increasing taxes, but also raising about $23 billion in war bonds through the campaigns like what you see in this poster here. And we're going to be looking at quite a few other ones. Now, all of these are part of that effort to win over the hearts and minds of the American people. For years, Wilson had maintained a policy of neutrality, and now he had to convince the nation to get behind the war effort. So he launched an ideological campaign based on the idea that the United States was fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy. This was a war of slogans. The war to make the world safe for democracy. The war to end all wars. The war effort confirmed the existence of a powerful centralized government, which many Americans perhaps hadn't even realized existed until this point. And the American war machine cranked into full effect. The government and big business united to churn out war supplies, greasing the national economy. The reality of the government's presence was most noted with the introduction of the draft. There had been a draft during the Civil War, and it inspired much protest. The Selective Service Act of World War I was enforced with quiet efficiency. Many young men were eager to enter the war. They were perhaps leaving the dull sameness of life on the farm, or the dreadful slums of the inner city, or they thought joining the army would be an improvement in their lives. But many others weren't so eager to support a war that they didn't understand, against an enemy that they didn't care to fight. But under the draft, they went anyway. The efficiency of the government reached its most disturbing pinnacle in the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which was headed by a newspaperman from Mississippi named George Creel. Being a newspaperman, Creel was accustomed to publicity. He knew how to advertise and he knew how to sell things to the American public. The CPI was a committee designed to drum up the kind of support for the war that was lacking to that point. Now, much of the work of the CPI we might consider positive. Anytime a nation is at war, it's good and useful for most of the country to get behind it, and in fact, there needs to be a campaign to explain what's going on. So the CPI churned out propaganda, utilizing films, cartoons, speeches. They printed 75 million pamphlets, and as I mentioned, posted millions of posters all around the country, like the ones you see on the screen. They also organized armies of so-called 4-minute men to give brief speeches in movie theaters, churches, union halls, and on the street, anywhere where crowds of Americans might be gathered. But the CPI had a darker purpose as well. While mobilizing support behind the war and cranking up patriotism, it also inspired a sense of fear, hatred, and paranoia about the other side. And it's important to note that millions of Americans of German heritage were subjected to the kind of insults and perhaps even slander that we see in these posters and many others. The CPI condemned all things German, spreading many rumors about the Germans. It also did other things like renaming sauerkraut as Liberty Cabbage. It banned the music of Wagner and other German culture. There are stories of Dachshunds being stoned in the streets, little wiener dogs being stoned in the streets. More disturbing, the CPI assembled lists of people whom it determined might be secretly sympathetic to the German cause. Jane Addams was at the top of many of these lists. The United States also passed a series of acts designed to secure American loyalty and support for the war, including the Espionage Act of 1917, which enacted harsh penalties for anti-war activity. And perhaps even more notorious, the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it illegal to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language, unquote, about the government, the president, or the military. And while it might be one thing if this were an empty letter, in fact, over 1,500 Americans were arrested under suspicion of disloyalty during World War I. The legacy of the CPI and the so-called super patriotism that it created is one of the darker legacies of the Wilson presidency, and one for which he draws great criticism. It's one thing through flag-waving songs and posters to try to rally American patriotic support for the war effort. It's another to have Americans arrested for writing or printing or protesting against the war, the kinds of rights that are enshrined in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We're going to be talking much more in the next few lectures about the legacies of the CPI and this atmosphere of fear and hatred of foreigners that it created.